My name is Sam, and for the better part of the last 3 years, my address has been Thorpe Peak Lookout, San Juan National Forest, Colorado. For 6 months out of the year, my entire existence is confined to a 14 by 14 foot room. This cabin, walled with thick glass on all four sides, is perched atop a lattice of steel girders, 60 feet above the bald, granite summit of a mountain that scrapes the sky at 12,480 feet. Below me, in every direction, lies a million-acre kingdom of spruce, fir, and unforgiving rock, a sprawling, silent wilderness that stretches to a horizon so distant it feels like the curve of the earth itself. It is by any definition a lonely job, a profession that seems to attract people like me, those who find more comfort in their own company than in a crowded room. Most who try it don't last a full season. They say the quiet gets too loud, but the solitude starts to eat away at them. For me, it has always been a fair trade for the view from my front door. The man who trained me was Elias Thorne, a wiry, sun-cured old-timer who had staffed this very tower since the Ford administration. His personality seemed hewn from the same granite as the peak he watched over. He was quiet, hard, and utterly without frills. He wasted nothing, not time, not movement, not words. On my first day, he gave me the grand tour of what he gruffly called the Glass Castle. He didn't just show me the Osborne Fire Finder. He made me use it, walking me through the meticulous process of sighting a landmark, reading the azimuth, and then triangulating its position with the lookout on Sentinel Dome, a faint speck on the northern horizon. He showed me the peculiar ritual required to light the ancient propane stove, the way you had to hold the knob just so and count to 5 before turning it. He explained the rainwater collection system, the way the barrels had to be checked for algae, and the temperamental nature of the shortwave radio that served as my only lifeline to the world below. His instructions were sparse, delivered in a low rumble, and punctuated by long, contemplative silences, during which he'd just stare out at the mountains as if they were old friends. When the tour was concluded, and he was satisfied that I wouldn't burn the place down or starve in my first week, he prepared to make the long hike back down to his truck. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the heavy steel latch, and turned to face me. The usual squint in his eyes, a permanent feature etched by decades of staring into the harsh mountain sun, sharpened into a look of profound, unsettling seriousness. "Just one thing you need to know about this place, kid," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur that was barely audible above the whisper of the wind. "A rule, you could call it. A local rule. If you hear someone knocking after the sun goes down, you don't answer it. No matter what." I managed a short, nervous laugh. The sound was thin and foolish in the vast emptiness of the landscape. I assumed it was some kind of tradition, a bit of spooky folklore meant to haze the new guy. The Rockies are saturated with ghost stories, tales of lost miners and ancient spirits, and I figured this was Thorpe Peak's local legend. But Elias didn't crack a smile. His expression remained as grim and unyielding as a winter sky. He simply gave a single, slow, deliberate nod, as if to confirm a terrible truth he'd just shared. Then he turned, opened the door, and descended the steep metal staircase, his small, tough form shrinking against the immense backdrop of the valley until he was finally swallowed by the dark green of the treeline. His words, however, didn't leave with him. They remained behind, hanging in the thin, cold air, an invisible weight in the silence of my new home. That was 3 seasons ago. In the intervening time, the profound solitude had transformed from a challenge into a comfort. Elias's strange, parting warning had receded into the back of my mind, becoming little more than a quirky anecdote, a piece of trivia about my unusual job. Life in the lookout tower was governed by a simple, powerful rhythm, the cadence of the sun. I would rise before dawn, the air in the cabin sharp and cold, and put coffee on the propane stove. I would watch, day after day, as the eastern sky performed its silent, breathtaking symphony, bleeding from the deepest indigo to a bruised purple, then to a fiery, impossible orange that set the edges of the distant peaks ablaze. My days were a slow, meditative dance of observation. I would make a full circuit of the cabin every 15 minutes, my binoculars a permanent extension of my eyes, my gaze sweeping across the endless carpet of the forest, searching for that one telltale sign of trouble. The faint, almost invisible wisp of white smoke that could signal the beginning of a disaster. It was a job that was 99% boredom and 1% sheer terror, Elias had said. The boredom I found peaceful. I was still waiting on the terror. When I wasn't actively scanning, I read voraciously. I worked my way through stacks of paperback novels left by previous lookouts, their pages soft and warped from years of fluctuating humidity. I read dense histories and complex philosophy. The Silence of the Tower, a perfect crucible for concentration. I kept a meticulous journal, not just logging weather patterns and visibility reports as required, but chronicling the secret life of the mountain. I learned to recognize individual animals. There was a particular three-antlered elk I called Nelson who favored a high alpine meadow to the west. I watched a golden eagle fledge her young on a sheer cliff face across the valley, a drama that unfolded over weeks. I learned the subtle dialects of the wind, from a gentle sigh that barely stirred the stunted pines to a furious, shrieking gale that made the entire tower hum like a tuning fork. The work itself was a comforting routine. Every 3 hours, like clockwork, I would take my weather readings, temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, wind direction, and radio them down to the ranger station in the valley. I performed the endless small tasks of maintenance, tightening the guy wires that anchored the tower to the bedrock, wiping the dust from the solar panels that power my radio and single reading lamp, checking the lightning rods for any signs of damage after a storm. It was a simple, almost monastic existence, and it suited me. But the nights were the true reward. Far from the obscuring haze of city lights, the celestial display was a nightly miracle. The Milky Way wasn't a faint, ethereal smudge. It was a brilliant, shimmering river of light, a celestial highway paved with 1 billion stars, so clear and bright it felt as if I could reach out and run my fingers through them. On those perfectly clear, windless nights, I'd take a steaming mug of tea out onto the narrow, graded catwalk that wrapped around the cabin. I would sit there for hours, a solitary audience member for the grand, silent turning of the cosmos. In those moments, I felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being both infinitesimally small and connected to everything. I was not a man on a mountain. I was a sailor on a calm sea, adrift in an ocean of galaxies. I had long since grown accustomed to the symphony of the wilderness. It's a common fallacy that such places are silent. They are, in fact, bursting with sound, with a language that you slowly learn to interpret. There was the sharp, yipping bark of a coyote pack on the hunt, a sound that would drift up from the lower valleys on a clear night. There was the terrifying, human-like scream of a mountain lion, a sound so unnerving it could make your heart stop for a beat, even when you knew what it was. I once heard a massive, ancient spruce tree surrender to gravity in the dead of a windless night. The sound was cataclysmic, a great tearing, splintering groan, followed by a ground-shaking boom that echoed through the canyons for what felt like a full minute. It sounded like the mountain itself was groaning in its sleep. But these were the normal sounds, the organic, living pulse of the forest. I learned to identify them, to categorize them, to understand their place in the natural order. They were the sounds of life and, often, of death, but they were never a threat to me in my steel and glass perch. They were a comfort, a constant reminder that even in my profound solitude, I was not truly alone. Elias's warning had become a fossil in my memory, a strange artifact from my first day that I'd occasionally recall with a private, knowing smile. The Rockies are steeped in old stories, in the folklore of the Ute who first inhabited these mountains and the prospectors who later came to tear them apart in search of silver and gold. There are tales of spirits that guard the passes, of strange, elusive beasts, of gateways to other worlds hidden in remote box canyons. I had come to categorize his words as just another one of those tales, a ghost story designed to add a little spooky mystique to the job, to test the psychological fortitude of the new lookout. After all, the premise, when examined in the clear light of day, was utterly preposterous. Who, in any sane or logical world, could possibly be knocking on my door? The nearest paved road was a 2-hour drive from the trailhead, and the trail itself was a 10-mile, leg-burning, lung-busting ascent that gained over 4,000 feet in elevation. It wasn't a casual stroll. It was a serious, high-altitude trek. Any official visitors, like Randy, the cheerful contractor who hauled up my propane canisters and non-perishable food supplies once a month, always radioed ahead at least a day in advance. He only ever came during the bright, safe hours of midday, his arrival always preceded by the distant, cheerful whine of his ATV. The notion of any visitor, let alone a nocturnal one, was simply beyond the realm of possibility. And so, I lived my life, content in my splendid isolation, watching the seasons turn from the vibrant, wildflower-strewn canvas of a high-country July to the stark, golden grandeur of a September on the verge of winter. The world could tear itself apart down below, but up here in my glass castle, everything was calm. Everything made sense. Until one night it didn't. The first time it happened was in late August of my 3rd season. A colossal, violent thunderstorm had been menacing the peaks all afternoon. The sky, which had been a placid, cloudless blue that morning, had slowly curdled, turning a bruised and swollen shade of purple-gray. The wind had been picking up steadily for hours, and by sunset, it was a living entity, a furious, shrieking presence that tore at the tower. The entire structure would groan and hum under the assault, swaying almost imperceptibly on its foundations, a feeling I had grown used to but never truly enjoyed. I had just finished my evening meal, a simple affair of rehydrated chili and a stale tortilla, and was trying to lose myself in a thick historical novel about the ill-fated Franklin expedition. The sun had vanished hours ago, prematurely consumed by the wall of black cloud, and the world outside my glass walls had become a chaotic, churning abyss of darkness and water. Rain, driven nearly horizontal by the gale-force wind, beat a frantic, drumming tattoo against the glass panes, the sound so loud it was hard to think. Every few minutes, a bolt of lightning would rip through the sky, a silent, blinding flash that momentarily illuminated the roiling clouds in stark, terrifying relief. The flash would be followed seconds later by a clap of thunder so loud and so close that it wasn't just a sound. It was a physical concussive force that vibrated deep in my chest and rattled the very bones of the cabin. It was in a brief, momentary lull between the shriek of the wind and the next deafening cannonade of thunder that I heard it. Knock! 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 The sound was faint, almost tentative, as if it were shy. It was nearly swallowed by the overwhelming maelstrom outside, but it was there. It was unmistakable. It was rhythmic, structured, and entirely alien to the chaotic sounds of the storm. It was the distinct, solid sound of knuckles on metal, and it had come from the door, the single, solid, windowless feature in my otherwise transparent home. My head snapped up from the pages of my book. My heart, which had been beating at a calm, steady rhythm, gave a sudden, violent lurch, hammering against the inside of my rib cage like a trapped bird trying to escape. I held my breath, my ears straining, desperately trying to isolate the sound again, to confirm what I thought I'd heard. But there was only the storm. The wind howled its mournful, rising song. The rain lashed the roof in a renewed frenzy, and a fresh peal of thunder shook the world. The knocking did not repeat. My first thought, my first desperate leap of logic, was that my mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be the wind. I tried to reason it out, to build a plausible explanation. A particularly sharp, focused gust of wind could have rattled the heavy door in its frame, creating a sound that mimicked a knock. Perhaps a loose piece of equipment I'd left on the catwalk, a stray wrench, a bucket, had been picked up by the wind and flung against the door. I mentally scanned the catwalk. I was meticulous about securing my gear, especially with a storm approaching. Everything was tied down or stored in the footlocker. It could have been a branch, I thought, but immediately dismissed the idea. It was a thought born of desperation, of a mind trying to find a normal explanation for an abnormal event. There were no trees tall enough to reach my cabin at this altitude. The last of the truly tall pines and spruces gave up the ghost 1,000 feet below my perch. Up here on the summit, there was only rock, hardy lichen, and a few stunted, wind-tormented bristlecone pines that looked more like gnarled, ancient sculptures than living trees. And the heavy wooden shutter on the inside of the door was latched securely, as always. The more I tried to rationalize it, the less sense it made. The sound had been too clean, too precise, too intentional. It wasn't the random, chaotic, rattling noise of a storm. It had a pattern, a cadence. It was the sound of a visitor. Slowly, carefully, I set my book aside and rose to my feet. The wooden floorboards were cool and solid beneath my socked feet as I crossed the small room. I stood before the door for a long, indecisive moment. A silent battle raging in my head between my rational, 21st century curiosity and a sudden, primal sense of dread that felt ancient and deep. I pressed my ear against the cold, painted steel, listening with an intensity that was almost painful. All I could hear was the muffled roar of the storm and the frantic, pulsing thrum of my own blood in my ears. I waited for a full minute, then another, my breath held tight in my chest. Nothing. The moment stretched, and with each passing second of silence, the rational part of my brain reasserted its dominance, scolding my primal fear. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. It was a trick of the wind, a phantom sound created by the storm's fury and my own solitude-addled mind. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine, I told myself, a mantra to ward off the growing unease. In the white noise of a tempest, in the chaos of rattling and howling, it can conjure whispers and knocks from the meaningless cacophony. It was a simple auditory illusion. Feeling a bit foolish, my heart rate beginning its slow descent back to normal, I backed away from the door and returned to my worn armchair. I picked up my novel, determined to find my place and lose myself in the story of men trapped in ice a world away. But the words on the page had become a meaningless jumble of black marks on a white background. I couldn't focus. My senses were now on high alert, every nerve ending in my body, tingling with a strange, new awareness. Every fresh gust of wind that slammed into the tower, every sudden volley of rain that hammered against the glass, now sounded like the prelude to another series of knocks. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck, the ancient instinctual feeling of being watched. I found myself glancing nervously at the dark, rain-streaked windows, half expecting to see a pale face peering in, a notion that was utterly terrifying and, I reminded myself, completely impossible given my 60-foot elevation. I tried to force a more plausible, albeit still wildly unlikely, explanation. A hiker. It had to be a lost hiker, caught in the storm. It was a possibility, however remote. Every season, some unprepared tourist would wander off a marked trail, misjudge the rapidly changing mountain weather, and find themselves in a desperate life-or-death situation. But the trail to the Thorpe Peak Lookout was notoriously difficult, poorly maintained, and barely marked on most recreational maps. It was not a trail for the faint of heart or the poorly equipped. No one in their right mind would attempt it in this weather, let alone in the pitch-black darkness. And if they were in trouble, if they were freezing or injured or terrified, why wouldn't they be yelling for help? Why wouldn't they be screaming their lungs out, using their last reserves of energy to get my attention? Why would they just knock? Quietly? The logistics of it were just as baffling. The door of my cabin opens onto the narrow, graded catwalk that encircles the entire structure. That catwalk is suspended 60 feet over a jagged, rocky slope. To get to my door in the middle of a gale-force wind and blinding rain, with lightning crashing all around, would be a feat of incredible, almost suicidal desperation. And having accomplished that, why would they be so polite? It didn't add up. The rest of the night was a total loss. Sleep was an impossibility. I sat in my chair, my book forgotten in my lap, with the single propane lamp casting a small, lonely island of warm, hissing light in the overwhelming, violent darkness. I watched the storm rage, my eyes constantly, compulsively flicking towards the silent, steel door. I was a ship's captain on his bridge, sailing through a hurricane, except the danger I feared wasn't outside in the elements, but waiting patiently, silently, on my doorstep. But the knocking never came again that night. The storm eventually wore itself out, and the silence that followed felt heavy and strange. By dawn, the storm had passed completely. It was as if it had never happened. The sky was a scrubbed-clean, brilliant blue, utterly devoid of a single cloud. The air smelled of rain and wet earth, and the clean, sharp scent of ozone. With a sense of lingering trepidation, I unlatched the heavy door and stepped out onto the wet, glistening catwalk. The world was utterly still, the silence profound and absolute after the chaos of the night. I made a slow, deliberate circuit of the catwalk, my gaze fixed on the ground below. The heavy rain had turned the dirt and gravel around the tower's 4 concrete footings into a soft, muddy canvas. It was a perfect surface for capturing footprints. There were none, not a single track, no sign that any person or any large animal had approached the tower from any direction. I leaned over the railing and scanned the steep metal staircase that led down to the trailhead. It was empty and gleaming wetly in the new sun. The trail itself, visible for a few hundred yards before it disappeared into a thick stand of firs, was deserted. There was no one, nothing. I retreated back inside the cabin, the cold mountain air having done little to clear the unease from my head. It had to have been a dream. That was the only explanation left that made any sense. A waking hallucination, perhaps a momentary slip in my perception brought on by the oppressive, electric atmosphere of the storm and the deep-seated loneliness I so rarely acknowledged. I had simply imagined it. I clung to that thought like a life raft. I had to believe it. I spent the rest of the day trying to force a sense of normalcy, trying to bury my lingering anxiety in the familiar, comforting rhythm of my routine. I took my morning weather readings, my voice sounding strained and unfamiliar in the quiet cabin as I called them into a radio that answered with only a loud, frustrating wall of static. The storm must have knocked out the repeater on Sentinel Dome. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence. It happened once or twice every season. But the timing felt deeply, profoundly unsettling. I scanned the horizon for smoke, made my meticulous entries in the logbook, and tried to lose myself in the simple, physical task of cleaning the already clean cabin. But a seed of anxiety had been planted in the fertile ground of my isolation. The familiar, comforting silence of my mountain home now felt different. It felt watchful, and for the first time in 3 years, I found myself dreading the fall of night. The escalation began with an agonizing, deceptive quiet. For 2 full nights after the storm, there was nothing. A profound, unnerving, and absolute silence reigned over Thorpe Peak. Each night, I sat in the darkness of the cabin, the propane lamp unlit, my nerves stretched as taut as the tower's guy wires in a high wind, listening. I sat there for hours, straining to hear anything beyond the familiar, natural sounds of the mountain. But the only sounds were the whisper of the gentle night breeze and the distant, mournful call of a hunter. With each passing hour of silence, a little more of my rational mind reasserted itself. I began to feel foolish, mentally chiding myself for letting a simple auditory hallucination, a trick of a violent storm, get the better of me. By the 3rd day, I had almost completely convinced myself that the incident had been a one-time anomaly, a perfect storm of atmospheric pressure, wind, and psychological suggestion. The radio was still out, which was an ongoing source of low-level annoyance and unease, but I told myself a maintenance crew would be sent to the repeater station eventually. I was safe. I was, as I had always been, completely alone. All was well. It was on the 3rd night, a night of perfect, crystalline clarity, that the knocking returned. The weather was placid. A vast, star-dusted sky arched overhead like a glittering dome, and a brilliant, nearly full moon hung in the inky blackness, bathing the entire landscape in a cold, ethereal, silvery light. The world outside my windows was as clear and sharp as a high-resolution photograph. There was no wind to blame for strange noises, no rain to obscure my vision, nothing to hide behind. I was sitting at my small wooden table, writing in my journal, trying to describe the way the moonlight made the distant, snow-dusted peaks seem to glow from within. That's when it came. Knock, knock, knock. This time, there was no ambiguity. There was no storm to provide cover, no gale to offer a plausible excuse. The sound was crisp, dry, and shockingly loud in the profound stillness of the night. It was the unmistakable, solid, deliberate sound of a human fist rapping smartly against the cold metal of my door. Every drop of blood in my body seemed to instantly turn to ice water. I froze mid-sentence, the pen still pressed to the paper, a half-formed word left hanging. It was real. I hadn't imagined it. It was back. My first panicked instinct was to shout, to call out, "Who's there?" in a voice I hoped would sound brave and commanding. But just as my mouth opened, just as I drew a breath to speak, Elias's warning, his solemn, grim face, flashed in my mind with the clarity of a lightning strike. If you hear someone knocking after the sun goes down, you don't answer it. No matter what. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a prank. This was a rule, and the old man had been deadly serious. In that moment, surrounded by the stark, moonlit silence of the high Rockies, I believed him with every fiber of my being. A primal fear, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced through my initial shock and lodged itself deep in my gut. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat at my table, a statue carved from fear, my ears straining in the ringing silence that followed the three knocks. The glass walls of my cabin, which had always felt like a connection to the magnificent, sprawling world outside, now felt like a terrifying vulnerability. I was in a fishbowl, a specimen in a glass box, pinned by the cold, indifferent light of the moon. I was 60 feet in the air, with absolutely nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Whoever or whatever was standing on that catwalk could see my silhouette, could see the soft, warm glow of my propane lamp, could see my every move. They knew I was here. They knew I was awake. Knock, knock, knock. It was louder this time, more forceful, more insistent. The sound seemed to reverberate through the small cabin. A wave of pure, unreasoning panic washed over me, a tidal wave of adrenaline that made my vision swim. I lurched to my feet, my chair scraping loudly, violently, on the wooden floor. The sound was an indictment, a confession that I was here. I scrambled to the propane lamp and fumbled with the small, greasy knob, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy. I managed to extinguish the flame, and the cabin was plunged into a disorienting darkness, a darkness made all the more stark by the cold, sterile moonlight pouring through the windows. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, chaotic rhythm of terror. My only thought was to hide, to make it seem as though no one was home, as though the cabin was empty of foolish, desperate hope. I dropped to my hands and knees, the rough, splintery floorboards pressing painfully into my palms, and crawled as quickly and silently as I could into the darkest corner of the room, behind my cot. I pulled a thick wool blanket over my head and body, a child's flimsy, magical defense against the monster in the closet. I clamped my jaw shut to keep my teeth from chattering and tried to control my ragged, shallow breathing, convinced that it, too, was as loud as a locomotive in the silence. I lay there for what felt like a lifetime, my body trembling uncontrollably, every sense I possessed on high alert. The knocking did not come again, but the silence that followed was somehow more terrifying. It was a heavy, pregnant silence, thick with expectation and menace. I felt a strange, low-frequency vibration begin to thrum up through the steel legs of the tower. It was a feeling more than a sound, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones and make my teeth ache. It was as if the tower itself was reacting to some immense, unseen energy source nearby, like a tuning fork resonating with a silent, powerful hum. I didn't dare move a muscle from my hiding spot until the first pale, gray light of dawn began to dilute the darkness, chasing the long, sharp shadows from the peaks. Only when the sun finally crested the eastern ridge, flooding the cabin with a warm, reassuring golden light of a new day, did I allow myself to uncurl my stiff, aching limbs. My entire body felt bruised and battered from the tension. With my heart still pounding a nervous, erratic rhythm, I crept to one of the windows and peered out from behind the frame. The catwalk was empty. The landscape was still and silent, bathed in the soft gold of morning. It was as if the night and its terrors had been nothing but a fever dream. With trembling hands, I forced myself to unlatch the door and step outside. The morning air was sharp and cold and tasted of pine. I inspected the door first, my eyes tracing every inch of its surface. There were no marks, no dents, no scratches, not even a smudge in the layers of old paint. It was pristine. I made a full, slow circuit of the catwalk, my eyes scanning for any sign, any clue, any tiny thing that was out of place. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a dropped piece of clothing, not a broken twig, not a single solitary thing. It was as if my visitor had been a ghost, a phantom capable of interacting with my door, but leaving no other trace of its existence in the physical world. I went back inside and tried the radio again, a desperate, foolish hope rising in my chest. "Thorpe Peak Lookout to Ranger Station. Come in," I said, my voice hoarse and cracking from disuse. Nothing but a wall of impenetrable static answered me. "Thorpe Peak, this is Sam Jones. Does anyone copy? I have an emergency." I pleaded into the microphone, the last word catching in my throat. Only the hiss and crackle of an empty channel replied. The repeater was definitely down. The feeling of being cut off, of being well and truly alone with this thing, settled into my stomach like a block of ice. I was on my own. That was the day the real, gnawing, soul-deep fear began to take root. It was no longer a question of whether something was out there. It was a question of what it was and what it wanted from me. I spent the day in a state of agitated paralysis. I couldn't eat. The thought of food made my stomach churn. I couldn't read. The words just swam before my eyes. I paced the 14-foot length of my glass cage like a trapped animal, my binoculars permanently affixed to my eyes as I scanned the surrounding slopes, the tree-line, the rocky crags. I was looking for anything, a hiker in a brightly colored jacket, a hunter in camouflage, an unnaturally large animal. But the mountains remained stubbornly, unervingly empty. The thought of abandoning the tower, which had been a fleeting, panicked idea before, now became a fixation, a desperate, repeating loop in my mind. I could pack my emergency kit, hike the 10 miles down to the road, and hitchhike to safety. But the thought of that hike, of being exposed and vulnerable on that winding, lonely trail, was almost as terrifying as staying. What if I encountered it out there, in the open, away from the flimsy security of my locked door? The sun would set long before I could make it halfway down. The idea of being caught in the forest, in the dark, with that thing hunting me, was a scenario straight out of my worst nightmares. No, the tower was the lesser of two evils. At least here, I was 60 feet up. At least here, there was a door to lock, a barrier between me and the unknown. As dusk began to bleed its palette of orange and purple across the western sky that evening, my anxiety escalated into a full-blown, mind-numbing panic. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit in the corner and wait for it again. I had to create a defense, no matter how pathetic. I began to barricade the door. I shoved my heavy, metal footlocker, filled with goods and gear, scraping it across the floor until it was pressed tight against the door. I wedged my small, sturdy wooden table between the footlocker and the opposite wall, creating a solid brace. I piled my 2 chairs on top of that, and then my empty water jugs. It was a pathetic, flimsy barrier, and I knew it. If something truly wanted to get in, it would offer little resistance. But it was a psychological shield. It was an act of defiance. It was something to do. I didn't even bother with a lamp that night. As soon as the last light faded from the sky, I was in my corner, wrapped in my wool blanket, my heaviest tool, a long, steel pry bar, clutched in my hands like a makeshift sword. I sat in the absolute, silent, moonless darkness, and I waited. The hours crawled by with an agonizing, torturous slowness. Every tiny creak of the tower, settling in the cooling air, every rustle of a pack rat in the space beneath the floorboards sent a fresh, sickening jolt of adrenaline through me. Midnight came and went. 1 o'clock. 2. A tiny, fragile sliver of hope began to bloom in my chest. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it only came on moonlit nights. Maybe my barricade had deterred it. Maybe, just maybe, it had moved on. It was then, in the deepest, most silent hour of the night, that I heard a new sound. It wasn't a knocking. It was something else entirely, something infinitely worse. It was a low, wet, dragging sound, and it was coming from directly below me. Schlurp, scrape. Schlurp, scrape. My blood, which had been sluggish with exhaustion, turned to ice in my veins. It was the sound of something heavy and slick, something sodden, being dragged against the rough, painted steel of the tower's support legs. It was climbing. It was bypassing the stairs, bypassing the catwalk, and it was coming straight up the girders. I could hear the slow, deliberate, rhythmic sound of its ascent. Scrape, drag, pause, scrape, drag, pause. It was getting closer. The sound was coming from the side of the tower where the solid wall and the door were located, the one blind spot I had, the one direction I couldn't see. The scraping noise stopped directly beneath the floor of the cabin. A silence so profound and absolute that it seemed to roar in my ears descended. I held my breath, every muscle in my body clenched as tight as a fist, the pry bar held in a white-knuckled grip. Then a new sound began, a sound so alien and so vile that it will be forever burned into the auditory cortex of my brain. It was a soft, wet, rhythmic thudding against the floorboards right under my feet. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a giant, waterlogged piece of meat being slapped against the wood. The thumping moved slowly, deliberately, from one side of the cabin's underside to the other, as if a slug the size of a man was crawling across it, exploring its surface with the soft, dead weight of its body. I was no longer just scared. I was in the grip of a terror so absolute it was transcendent. It was a pure, animalistic fear that bypassed all higher thought, a complete system overload. Silent tears streamed down my face as I sat, paralyzed, in my corner, listening to this obscene thing moving just inches below me, separated only by an inch of plywood and the floorboards. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind gibbering, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years, a desperate, silent scream for deliverance. Make it go away. Please, just make it go away. The wet thumping stopped. It stopped directly beneath the small, square trapdoor set into the center of the cabin floor. The trapdoor was there for maintenance access to the underbelly of the cabin, a simple wooden hatch held in place by 2 heavy-duty sliding bolts on my side, on the inside. Then came the knocking. It wasn't at the door. It was coming from the floor. Knock, knock, knock. The impacts were thunderous, powerful, bone-jarring. The entire cabin shook and vibrated with each blow. It was right there, directly beneath me, and it was trying to get in through the floor. I let out a choked, strangled gasp and scrambled away, crab-walking backward on my hands and heels until my back slammed into the cold glass of the far wall. The heavy pry bar felt like a child's toy in my hands. The trapdoor, that simple 2-foot by 2-foot square of wood, began to jump and rattle violently in its frame with each successive blow. I could see the wood around the edges beginning to splinter and crack under the incredible, relentless force. It wasn't going to hold. Crack! A loud, sharp, splintering sound echoed through the small room as one of the crossbeams on the underside of the trapdoor gave way. The knocking immediately became a frantic, furious, percussive battery. It knew it was breaking through. It was frenzied. I was sobbing openly now, my breath coming in ragged, hysterical gasps. This was it. This was how I was going to die, eaten by some thing in a glass box at the top of the world. Then, just as I was certain the door would burst inward in a shower of splintered wood, it stopped. The violent knocking ceased as abruptly as it had begun. A ringing, terrifying silence fell over the cabin. I waited, my body tense for the final, explosive breach. But it never came. After an eternity that was probably no more than a minute, I heard the sound again. The wet, scraping sound, moving away from the cabin, back down the steel legs of the tower, retreating into the darkness from which it had come. I did not sleep that night. I didn't even move. I sat pressed against the glass wall, my eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the splintered, damaged trapdoor in the center of the room. I watched it until the sun came up, a survivor of a shipwreck watching the tide recede, revealing the wreckage. When the full light of morning finally filled the cabin, the raw terror of the night began to recede, replaced by a cold, grim, exhausted certainty. I could not spend another night in this tower. It was no longer a question of if it would get in. It was a question of when. Tonight, it had tested the floor and found it wanting. Tomorrow night, it would succeed. I had to leave. Now, I waited until the sun was high and bright in the sky. A pathetic, superstitious hope that this creature was nocturnal, that the daylight would keep it in whatever lightless hole it called home. I kicked away the pathetic barricade from the door, my hands shaking so violently I could barely work the latch. I burst out onto the catwalk, gulping the cold, clean air into my lungs, my eyes darting frantically at the ground below. As always, there was nothing. No tracks, no sign, not a single thing disturbed. I refused to look underneath the cabin. I did not want to see what marks might have been left on the steel beams. I didn't want to see what might be clinging to the underbelly of my floor, waiting for my shadow to pass over. I ran back inside, grabbed my worn hiking backpack, and began stuffing it with only the barest essentials. My remaining water bottle, a bag of beef jerky, my flashlight, and the emergency flare gun with its 3 precious cartridges. I didn't bother with my books, my clothes, my journals. They were anchors, and I needed to be light. I needed to fly. Before I left, I grabbed the official lookout logbook from the table. My hand was shaking so badly that my handwriting was a barely legible, spidery scrawl. I wrote my final entry. Something is out here. It comes at night. It knocks. Last night I tried to get in through the floor. Radio is out. I am abandoning the tower at 10:45 a.m., August 28th. If anyone finds this, tell them Elias was right. For God's sake, don't answer the door. I left the logbook lying open on the table, a message in a bottle cast into a sea of wilderness. Then, without a single backward glance at the place that had been my home and was now my tomb, I fled. I clattered down the steep metal stairs, my boots ringing out a frantic, panicked rhythm of escape. I hit the trail at a dead run, my lungs burning in the thin air, my legs pumping furiously. I didn't care about the treacherous, uneven terrain, the rocks that threatened to twist an ankle, the roots that lay in wait to trip me. Adrenaline, pure and potent, was my only fuel. I ran and ran, propelled by a terror so profound that it had become a physical force, pushing me down the mountain, away from the sky, away from that horrible, waiting silence. The 10-mile hike down the mountain was not a hike. It was a controlled fall, a frantic, desperate flight through a world that had suddenly become hostile and menacing. Every snap of a twig in the deep woods was the sound of a pursuing footstep. a heavy tread just behind me. Every dark shadow cast by the ancient, towering pines was a lurking figure, a predator waiting patiently for me to pass. The whisper of the wind through the needles of the spruce and fir trees sounded like a voice, my name being hissed on the breeze, a sibilant, mocking sound. I didn't stop. I didn't dare. To stop was to be caught. To rest was to die. I scrambled down steep scree fields, sending showers of rock and shale clattering into the canyons below, the noise echoing in the stillness, broadcasting my position. I leaped over fallen logs, my muscles screaming in protest, my joints jarring with each impact. I pushed my body far beyond its normal limits, driven by a single, overriding, primal imperative. Get down. Get out. Get away. The image of the splintered trapdoor was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. The memory of the wet, thudding sound was an endless loop in my ears. I didn't even stop for water, my throat a dry, rasping desert, my tongue thick in my mouth. My only thought was of the descending sun, a celestial clock ticking down the precious minutes until the darkness returned, and with it, the hunter. The shadows were growing long, stretching like grasping, skeletal fingers across the narrow trail, when I finally, blessedly, stumbled out of the tree-line and onto the wide, gravelly dirt road at the trailhead. I had never in my life been so overjoyed to see a man-made object. The sight of the simple, weathered wooden sign marking the start of the Thor Peak Trail was like the sight of a rescue ship to a drowning man. My legs, which had carried me so far, so fast, gave out completely. I collapsed onto the rough gravel, the sharp stones digging into my knees and hands, and I wept. The terror, the exhaustion, the sheer, mind-breaking horror of the last few days poured out of me in great, heaving, racking sobs that tore my raw throat. I was a mess, a wreck of a man, but I was alive, and I was down from the mountain. I didn't have to wait long. A battered, rust-colored pickup truck, its engine rattling with a sound like a can full of angry bolts, came bouncing and swaying down the washboard road. The driver, a weathered old rancher with a face like a topographical map of the very mountains I'd just fled, slowed to a stop beside me. He leaned his arm on the open passenger side window and peered down at me. His eyes narrowed with a mixture of practiced curiosity and genuine concern. He took in my wild, terrified eyes, my torn and dirty clothes, my trembling, exhausted state, and seemed to make a decision. He didn't ask what I was running from. He didn't ask what had happened. I think he saw in my face that I had seen something from the dark, forgotten places of the world, and he knew better than to ask for details. Some things in these mountains you don't talk about. "You need a ride into town, son?" he asked, his voice calm and steady as a rock. I could only nod, unable to form words through my sobs. He pushed the passenger door open from the inside. "Get in. You look like you've seen a ghost." I pulled my protesting body to its feet and stumbled into the cab, collapsing onto the cracked, sun-warmed vinyl of the bench seat. The cab smelled of hay, engine oil, and old, strong coffee. It was the most comforting, most civilized, most wonderfully human smell I had ever experienced. I didn't tell him the truth. I couldn't. How could I possibly explain the knocking, the scraping, the thing under the floor? He would think I was insane or high on drugs. So I gave him the plausible story, the one I had constructed in my head on the frantic journey down. I told him my radio had gone out a few days ago, that a bad storm had spooked me, and that the profound isolation had finally gotten to me, triggering a series of intense, debilitating panic attacks. It was the story of a man who had simply and unspectacularly cracked under the well-known strain of the job. The rancher just nodded slowly as he put the truck in gear and drove, his eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead. "Happens," he said, and that was all. He didn't press for more. He understood. He drove me the 40 miles to the nearest town, a small, dusty community called Silver Creek, and dropped me at the only motel, a single-story affair with a flickering neon sign. I thanked him, my voice still a raw, painful croak, and he just gave me another slow, knowing nod before driving off, leaving me in a cloud of dust. From the blessed anonymity and safety of the motel room, after drinking what felt like a gallon of water, I called the district ranger's office and officially quit my job. I fed the head ranger, a gruff but fundamentally fair man named Henderson, the exact same story I'd given the rancher. I told him the solitude had broken me, that I wasn't cut out for it after all. I could hear the weary resignation in his voice over the phone. It was clear he'd heard similar stories before from lookouts who couldn't handle the isolation. He told me not to worry about the personal gear I'd left behind, that they'd send a crew up to close the tower for the winter in a few weeks anyway, and they'd box it up for me. He wished me luck, told me to take care of myself, and that was that. My life as a fire lookout was over, ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, lie-filled phone call. For the next week, I holed up in that cheap, musty motel room, trying to decompress, trying to process, trying to forget. I barely slept. When I did, my dreams were a chaotic hellscape of sound. The insistent, rhythmic knocking, the wet, dragging scraping, and the final, violent splintering of wood. During the day, I kept the television on constantly, the volume turned up loud. I needed the noise, the chatter, the relentless, meaningless presence of other human voices to drown out the memory of the silence, and what that silence had held. The memory of the events at the tower began to feel distant, unreal, like a particularly vivid and terrifying nightmare that was slowly, mercifully, fading with the morning light. I clung desperately to the idea that I had suffered a complete psychotic break, that the extreme isolation, the high altitude, the oppressive atmosphere of the storm had all conspired to create a powerful, sustained, multi-sensory hallucination. It was a comforting explanation. It was a sane explanation. But deep in the core of my being, in the part of me that still remembered the bone-jarring vibration of the trapdoor being struck from below, I knew it was a lie. I knew what I had heard. I knew what I'd felt. And I knew it was real. It was about 10 days after my escape from the mountain, after I'd bought a bus ticket and put 500 miles of desolate Wyoming highway between me and those cursed mountains, that I got the call. I was in a dingy motel in Cheyenne when my cell phone rang. The caller ID said it was the main office of the San Juan National Forest. My heart seized. It was Ranger Henderson. His voice on the phone was different from when I had quit. The gruff, businesslike tone was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. It was quiet, strained, and deeply, profoundly unsettled. "Sam," he started, and there was a long pause. "Henderson here. We sent a couple of seasonal kids up to Thorpe Peak yesterday to winterize the place. Get all boarded up before the first big snow." He paused again. "They found your logbook." Another pause. "It's a damn good thing you left when you did, son. A damn good thing." A cold, heavy dread trickled down my spine, chilling me to the bone. "What did they find, Henderson?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Well," he said, and he sounded like he was choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. "First off, you were right about the trapdoor. It was smashed to kindling, completely destroyed from below. The heavy steel bolts were bent clean out of their housings. The wood was shattered. Whatever did it was strong. Incredibly, unnaturally strong." He paused again, and I could hear him take a deep, shaky breath on the other end of the line. "But that's not the strange part, Sam. The kids, they found deep gouges on the outside of the main door. Big, deep, parallel scratches in the steel like something with enormous claws was trying to get out." My mind reeled, trying to process the word. "Out? Out? What do you mean out?" And then there were the prints. Henderson continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. "The kids found them all over the floor inside the cabin. They said they were caked in mud and something else. Something dark and greasy. They weren't boot prints, Sam. They weren't from a bear or a mountain lion or any animal we know of. They were strange, bizarre. The kids took pictures. They were prints of something long and thin, with way too many joints. Like a big insect's leg, maybe? Or a finger that was 3 feet long and bent in 4 places. And they were everywhere. On the floor, on the underside of the table, even a few on the ceiling, right above where the trapdoor was. I was silent, my mind failing to form a picture of what he was describing. It was too alien, too impossible. It was a shape that didn't belong to our world. But here's the thing that's been bothering me all day, Sam. Here's the thing that's going to keep me up at night. The reason I'm calling you, Henderson said, his voice now a raw, terrified whisper. The prints lead from the broken trapdoor to the main door. The barricade? The footlocker and chairs? It was all knocked over, smashed aside, but from the inside. The inside of the door is covered in those same muddy prints and those same deep claw marks. It looks like whatever broke in through the floor couldn't get back out the way it came. It looks like when you barricaded that door, you trapped it inside. It was in there with you, Sam, all night long, and it was trying desperately to get out. The phone slipped from my numb, nerveless fingers and clattered onto the cheap, threadbare carpet of the motel room floor. Henderson was still talking, but I couldn't hear him. A roar like a jet engine filled my ears. The room began to spin, the ugly, patterned wallpaper swirling around me. I stumbled backward and collapsed onto the bed, my mind a maelstrom of pure, unadulterated horror. It hadn't been trying to get in through the floor. It had already gotten in, on a previous night, perhaps, maybe during one of the nights of silence, when I had foolishly started to believe I was safe. It had crawled up the tower and found a way into the dark, cramped, crawl space beneath the cabin floor, the one place I never checked, the one place I couldn't see. It had been hiding there, just inches from me, in the dark, silent space beneath my feet. Living there. Waiting for what? I don't know. I don't want to know. And on that last night, when I had so frantically and so proudly built my pathetic little barricade, I hadn't been locking it out. I had been locking it in. It had been trapped in the cabin with me. All night, as I had cowered in the corner, clutching my pry bar, sobbing in terror. The thing had been on the other side of the floorboards, just as desperate, just as panicked, trying to get out of the trap I had inadvertently set. The knocking on the floor, it wasn't an attack. It was a plea, or a demand. It was trying to get my attention, trying to get me to move the barricade, to open the door, to let it out. The final, violent assault on the trapdoor wasn't an attempt to get to me. It was the frantic, final act of a caged animal trying to escape its prison. I have never been back to the Rocky Mountains. I moved as far away as I could, to a city, a sprawling, anonymous place of concrete and steel and endless, reassuring noise. I live in a high-rise apartment building now, on the 27th floor, surrounded on all sides by the comforting, anonymous presence of thousands of other people. I have 3 heavy-duty deadbolts on my door. I have blackout curtains on my windows. I sleep with the television on, a constant stream of human voices to ward off the silence. But I never, ever feel truly safe. The memory of that last night in the tower is not a memory anymore. It's a part of me. It's a wound in my mind that will not heal, a cold spot in my soul that will never be warm again. It replays in my head in the quiet hours of the night, a silent, looping horror film that I'm forced to watch over and over again. I never told anyone the full story Henderson told me. Who would believe it? They would say I was crazy, that I had misinterpreted what he'd said, that I had filled in the gaps with my own paranoia and trauma. They would find a rational explanation. But there is no rational explanation for a 3-foot-long finger with too many joints. I think now that I finally understand Elias's warning, the one I dismissed as a silly ghost story, the one that I now understand was the most important piece of advice I have ever received in my entire life. If you hear someone knocking after the sun goes down, you don't answer it. No matter what. He didn't say not to let them in. He just said not to answer. Don't acknowledge it. Don't engage with it. Pretend you're not there. Because some things, once they know for sure that you're home, will do absolutely anything to get inside. And some things, once they're inside with you in the dark, will do anything to get out. I don't know what that thing was. A creature unknown to science? A spirit of the mountain? Ancient and angry? Something else entirely. Something that slipped through a crack in the world in a place where the air is thin and the silence is deep? I don't want to know. All I know is that it's out there, living in the high, silent, lonely places of the world, in the spaces just beyond our flickering campfires and our understanding. And sometimes, late at night, when the city outside my window has finally fallen into a semblance of quiet, I'll hear the old buildings settle, a pipe will groan in the wall, and my heart will seize in my chest, my blood turning to ice. Because for a split second, it sounds just like a soft, tentative rapping on a distant door. A sound I know I will hear for the rest of my life, in my waking hours and in my dreams. Knock, knock, knock.